Hello everyone, I'm Ari Babel, I'm a licensed therapist, and welcome to Playing with Psychology. This is an educational and hopefully entertaining series where I discuss video games and do psychosocial analysis on video games and the characters and the topics found within. I also like to talk about the representation of mental health and mental disorder in these games and determine whether the game is either adding to stigma or around these topics or adding to a positive discussion around these topics. Today's game is Celeste. Now, fair warning, if you have not played Celeste and you want to, stop watching, go play, because there are spoilers in this. So, you have been warned. There are spoilers in this. So, watch at your own risk. Okay. Quick disclaimer. This presentation is for educational and entertainment purposes only. This is not meant to be a formal diagnosis or treatment plan for any real person. Ari Babel, that's me, does not own any of the games or characters represented in this series. All opinions stated in this presentation are mine alone. This is more of a fan theory, guided by psychosocial theories, and this is not game canon. I also would like to mention that I use the APA's DSM-5 when discussing my diagnostic criteria. If you are not in the United States or Canada, the standards for determining diagnostic criteria may vary, so please keep this in mind while viewing if you are not in the US or Canada. I do suggest you look up what your country uses as diagnostic criteria and let me know in the comments, because that's cool and I always like to know. So this thick book right here. Moving on. So, I'd like to give a brief overview of some of the things that I'm going to talk about in this presentation. And I'm going to try to break it down in such a way that everybody can understand. So, the first thing that we're going to cover, if you've never heard of it, is ego psychology. I'm not going to go into the discussion just here, but overview. Ego psychology, person and environment, trans stigma, and the representation and presentation of depression and anxiety in a video game. So first of all, we have to discuss the characters that we're going to be looking at today. The first character we're looking at is Badeline. She is the protagonist of the game. And first thing we know about her is that she wants to climb the Celeste mountain because she feels she needs to challenge herself. That is her driving motivation for going to the mountain, for pushing on, for why the game exists. But to further that point, as we're playing the game, we learn that she lives with depression and anxiety. And in fact, this depression and anxiety does present itself in the game. And we, the player, get to experience a bit, which is really cool, and we'll discuss that later on in the presentation. And another thing I'd like to mention that I think is important when understanding this character and this analysis is that Badeline is a trans woman. And this is not in the game explicitly, however, it has been dev confirmed and widely accepted. Next character we're going to need to talk about is Badeline. Now, Badeline is a part of Badeline, and she doesn't actually ever call her Badeline. That's kind of what we, the community who've played this game, have nicknamed her, but she calls herself, appropriately, a part of me. And this is a part of Badeline that came to life after she saw her reflection in a mirror on the mountain. And now we know that Celeste Mountain is a little bit magical, so we have to suspend our little bit of disbelief here. But Celeste Mountain is magical, and it has actually taken this part of Badeline and made her physical, made her real. Well, you know, she's always been real, but we'll get to that in a minute. So, Badeline is kind of the antagonist, and she claims all the time when things go wrong, she's just trying to be pragmatic. She's the pragmatic one. She's the one who sees things as they really are. And a lot of times she says, I'm only trying to help. She's quick to anger, especially when she is being accused of being the antagonist. That's when she's like, well, I'm trying to help, I'm trying to do this and that, I'm not the bad one. And she really pushes back really hard on that. At some point in the game, if you've played, you'll see she actually becomes a monster with like crazy Medusa hair and everything. So yeah, so definitely when she feels threatened, when somebody's telling her she's wrong, when somebody's telling her she's being bad or wrong, she gets very, very angry. And according to the wiki, the Celeste wiki, it said she thinks with logic and not from the heart. So that's going to be important later on in the presentation. Try to keep that in mind if you can. So, first things first, what is ego psychology? Now, when I was in school, this image right here, which is an image of a, iceberg, an iceberg. And as you know, icebergs you can only see about, I think it's 10% above the water, and 90% of it is underwater. And the image it's in 3 parts. On the left-hand side, completely, it says superego, and part of it is above water, part of it is underneath the water. On the other side, it's broken in half. And there's a part that's underwater completely, that's called the id. And there's a part that's half under, half over, completely called the ego. And so those are the 3 parts of the personality, of the mind, according to Sigmund Freud. So ego psychology was a practice developed by, as I said, Sigmund Freud, and it was the predominant way of thinking about the mind and development and mental disorders, especially in the US, until about the 60s, when other theorists kind of came over and from different parts of the world, and also just even in the United States started to say, hey, maybe we got to think about this a little bit differently. Maybe this is a little too tunnel vision, narrow-minded for us. But still, it is important to learn ego psychology as the foundation of psychology, because it's still taught. So I think this is an important thing for people to learn. And I think that there's some parts of it that are still useful and helpful. So, like I said, ego psychology divides personality into 3 different parts: the id, the ego, and the superego. So the first thing we'll talk about right now is the id. The id is our first part of our mind to develop, according to Freud, and it is the impulsive part. It's powered by the pleasure principle, aka what would be best for the body to make it feel good. It's not thinking about anything other than I want to feel good. So think about babies. When babies are hungry, they cry. All they could think about is, I'm cold, I'm hungry, I peed myself, please change me. You know, that is why the id develops first, and I think that it is a very good reason for the id to develop first, and just to realize that the id is there for our physical comfort and protection. So an example is, I'm hungry, I want to eat, I'm horny, I want to screw, I'm angry, I want to hit. And the id lives in the unconscious part of our minds for the most part, and we're generally unaware of the id, though we still kind of grapple with the impulses. The next part I'm going to talk about is the ego. That is on the upper right-hand side, half submerged, half above the water. The ego is the self in reality. I kind of like to think of it as us in real time. You know, it lives in the conscious part of our minds, and it is how we express ourselves. It's that part that goes, I'm going to tell that person that. You know, it's how we are interacting with reality. And then there is the superego, which is on the left-hand side. So the superego is mostly underwater, but a little bit above water, because the superego is social constructs, norms, or what Freud called morality. It's the part of us that we can think about and sort of implicitly think about. Implicitly meaning it's something that we understand, it's something we have absorbed, and maybe we don't outright think about it, but it's when, you know, they say in the corner of your mind, in the back of your mind. So it's in the forefront and the back of your mind. And the superego constructs that ideal self, that we have the superego to really control the socially unacceptable impulses of our id so we could function in society. It kind of puts us on this pedestal, you know, and the superego and the ego together kind of tell us, you know, kind of temper the id in a way. Which brings me to my next slide. So the way that I like to think of it, I don't find the glacier to be very helpful to me personally. I like to think of the 3 parts of the mind as a scale. On the left-hand side of the scale, on the left-hand weight, is the id. And then on the right hand is the superego. And these are parts of our mind that literally battle each other. The id says, I'm hungry, and that person's eating food, and I'm gonna take the food right out of their hand and eat it. The superego then goes, we can't survive in society like that. We will be admonished, we will be this, we will be that. And it is then the ego that balances them out and says, okay, you know what we're going to do instead? We're really hungry. We're going to go over to that person and ask if we could share the sandwich. You know, so it's really this balancing act. And sometimes when these three parts are competing with each other, as they do, one can be stronger than the other. And in Freudian ego psychology, that was believed to cause maladaptive personalities, maladaptive coping disorders, and even mental disorders. So it's very important that we understand that these are in competition with each other, and one can win out of the other. And ideally, you want the ego to win to keep the other two under control, but that's not always the case. So, bringing this back to the game, right? You're probably like, well, how does this fit in? So, when we look at Badeline, to me, I feel that she is super ego gone wrong. Because, you know, she is always saying, I'm just trying to help. You know, I'm just trying to keep you within the social norms. You know, you're not a mountain climber, is something that she says quite specifically, I remember, to Badeline. And to me, that just screams like, beemer, meemer. That just screams super ego of, you're not doing a normal thing. Go home and be a normal person. You're going to get admonished if you don't do this well, so it's better to go home and not do it at all. You know, and Badeline's superego, aka Badeline, is very rooted in negative self-talk about herself. And we'll discuss it maybe a little bit more. But she says to Badeline, you're nothing without me, which just really sounds morally superior to me. And also the fact, like I said earlier, anytime she is told you're being bad, you're like, anytime it's implied by Badeline that she's being antagonistic, she gets righteous, very self-righteous. So to that end, I think it's safe to say that Badeline's superego kind of gone wrong, kind of too much in control there. That competition, the superego's coming out on top. Now, too much superego can lead to depression and anxiety and guilt. And that is because when we fall short of that perfect self-image, the superego kind of thrusts upon that on us. We can experience the guilt, the shame, which in then can present itself as depression and anxiety. That's actually pretty common. So, yeah. And then we look at Badeline, and she's the ego, right? Because she is the person the person in reality, reacting, doing things in real time. And I think the game is really cool that the conflict is within Badeline's own self. And the whole point of the game is her speaking to herself and learning to balance herself and honestly love herself. So that is why I think that this is a great representation of ego psychology. So what we like to do in psychosocial practice is we look at the person as a whole person. So for that, we assess their strengths and their risks. A strength is something that somebody does well, or a part of their life that is functioning very well, or generally something that we can see as a positive. And we like to really guide our work from a strengths perspective. It's so much better than saying, you know, oh, I'm depressed and I'm bad and I'm this and I'm that, and us going, yes, you have depression and you have all of these bad things. Yes, we do give diagnoses. Yes, we do talk about them. But we really want to guide our therapy from what is working, not what is wrong. So, looking at Badeline as a whole person, starting with strengths. So, Badeline is aware of her depression and anxiety, and honestly, as I say all the time, knowing is half the battle. If you are aware and you know, that's half the battle. Now let's do the work, you know, because sometimes when you don't even know, when you're at the pre-contemplation of, hey, something might be wrong, you're at the crossroads of deny it or realize it. And I think that in most cases, realize it is the better way of handling it. So it has seemed that she has gone to therapy before. It is something that Badeline talks about in the game. As another strength is that she knew she needed to change to try to feel better. And I think that this is a strength because oftentimes when things aren't going well, I think, and I am honestly very guilty of this, give up or try the same thing that's not working over and over and over again. So the fact that she even realizes, hey, I need to do something different. I need to click the brain or something. I think that's a great strength, and it tells me that she's more in tune with herself than she even realizes. She's determined, so determined to climb this mountain. Nothing's gonna stop her. And to me, again, another strength. The fact that she has set a goal out for herself and she's so determined to do it, that tells a lot about her character to me, and it's good stuff. And another thing is she calls her mom in the game after the bad dream. And it seems to me that she has some sort of support system with her mother. Even just being able to talk to her. Again, we don't really know how close she is to her mother or anything like that. But having some sort of supports, somebody to talk to, anyone to lean on, is such a strength. It's such a good thing to have. Social supports. We are animals. We are social creatures, humans. It is so important that we have others to lean on and connect when things aren't exactly going right. And, of course, she's great at platforming. Like, if you've ever played that game, she's great at platforming. So, very good strength. Now, let's talk about risks, right? So, Badeline, being a transgender, does put her at some risk due to stigma and discrimination against trans people. We will go on in another slide about that, but that is, I think, a number one risk there. And also, another thing that kind of concerns me is that she's choosing to isolate. So she says in the beginning of the game at some point, again, we're not present for it, but let's just assume the beginning of the game, something's wrong. I'm not feeling better. I need to do something. I need to challenge myself. I'm going to go climb a mountain alone. Instead of, I'm going to join a book club, or I'm going to call my mom again, or maybe I'll visit family, or, you know what I mean? It's just the fact that she's going to climb a mountain alone. Isolation increases loneliness and depression symptoms. So for me, I'm like, the fact that that was her first choice kind of makes me go, And repression. The whole point of this game is showing us how Badeline is repressing a lot of herself. That's why Badeline comes to life, and that's why Badeline is doing what she's doing. So again, these are kind of risks I see that could make her, feel a little bit worse and maybe make her slide back in her treatment, so to say. So let's talk a little bit about trans stigma. So why is this so important? Before we even get into it, we can't isolate these experiences from the discussion around mental illness and mental health, because environment does impact our well-being overall. It's not just our physical well-being, but our mental well-being as well. Think about it. If there were no stressors in your life, you'd probably feel a lot of relief too. So, looking at this, according to the U.S. Trans Survey Executive... I put survey twice, sorry. According to the U.S. Trans Executive Survey, which was published in 2016, trans people are more likely to experience severe economic hardship, thus leading to poverty, thus leading to more homelessness. And I'd like to note that access to housing is exceptionally limited for transgender people. A lot of shelters are men only, women only, families only, whatever only. And this really does kind of make it very uncomfortable and very impossible for trans people to get into a safe housing assistance program. Speaking of safe, trans people in the US are more likely to, experience threats and harassment, and especially by the police. 58% of respondents in that survey reported mistreatment by the police. So, again, back to the housing assistance assistance programs, if you don't feel safe in a shelter, who are you supposed to call? The police. If the police are going to harass you and threaten you and possibly hurt you, of course you're even now more in danger. There's also something to be said about the lack of access to healthcare. It's very, very complicated when you are trying to express yourself in the medical system and the medical system is telling you, no, that's not how I see it. I have 2 boxes. Pick one, So the lack of access to healthcare is just really a big stressor in so many of our lives in general, that the fact that it's magnified for a trans person makes it even more stressful and harder for them to even receive the help they need. And of course, they have a higher risk of mental illness. Now, again, think of that lack of access to healthcare. These things, they're all linked. Nothing is a bubble here. And trans stigma, it's just affects the person in so many different facets. Their overall well-being, their physical well-being, their mental well-being. And it's something that we need to keep in mind when working and living and interacting in our everyday lives with trans people, but also in the lens of this game. So, now, if Badeline walked into my office, what might be some things that I might ask, Tell me about your past experiences in therapy. What worked? What didn't work? I'd like to know. I need a baseline. I don't want to keep on trying things that maybe didn't work for her the first time or second time around. Tell me more about your social circle. I want to know who are your supports, your friends, your families, your colleagues. A lot of therapists will use ecomaps and genograms to map out family members, friends, different places that a person likes to go, different activities they like to do with different people, to try to keep in mind, when somebody's saying, I feel lonely, I have this, I have that, fall back on that. Think about that thing that we did together. What can you use? What resources do you have? And tell me more about what has worked in the past, right? I want to know more about coping mechanisms that have worked. And you know what? Sometimes there aren't, and that's okay. But I definitely think it's a discussion worth having. Do you have any hobbies? Have you tried any meditation, mindfulness, things like that? Now, in the game, she does try some mindfulness with Theo, which is really cool. But what else has worked? What else hasn't worked? Blah, blah, blah. These are things that I would do at least on the intake or first time meeting Badeline if somebody like Badeline walked into my office. Diagnosis? Well, we don't have to make one. We don't have to talk about possible diagnoses, because we have one. 2, actually, that Badeline tells us herself. And, we gotta trust the client, and we gotta trust Badeline when she tells us these things. So, depression. And how is that depression presenting itself in the game? Well, poor self-image and self-esteem is a very telltale sign of persistent depression. And we see that throughout the game. Anxiety. We see that throughout the game, too. In fact, we actually literally see it, which is really cool. I love how the game actually shows us this event. She has a panic attack in a lift with Theo, and we see the screen get black, and things get small, and scary, and claustrophobic, and a little shaky, and, I think in her picture, when she's speaking, she's all like, oh, and I think it's really, really cool how the game actually shows us physically a panic attack. Now, panic attacks do vary for people. Not everybody is going to have the same symptoms when having a panic attack, but generally, I think that this was a really cool way to show people who maybe have never had a panic attack what that might look like on screen. Pretty cool. So, sorry. Now, let's talk about possible goals and interventions that we could do with someone like Badeline. So, our first goal would be to help Badeline understand when her negative self-criticisms are affecting her. So when she's having these patterns of bad thoughts of, I'm not good enough, blah, 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 I'd like her to realize when that spiral is happening. Because if you can figure out when that's happening, hopefully you could deploy some different tactics to kind of stop the train at the station, Everybody gets off, nobody gets back in until we're feeling a little bit better. What intervention would I do for her in this case? I would do something called CBT. CBT is a very customized approach to each patient, which focuses more on the cognitive processes or the way you're thinking that produce feelings. Now, of course, we don't just have negative thoughts, we have good thoughts too, right? But CBT is focusing a little bit more on the negative thoughts and the things we kind of want to curb. It's really good for changing behaviors, but also changing bad thoughts. So the goal of CBT, like I said, is to identify and intervene. So you identify the negative thoughts, behaviors, patterns, and then once you identify the patterns and the behaviors and all that good stuff, you're going to intervene. You're going to change them with something helpful, hopefully something nurturing. And it's basically changing how you cope with bad thoughts, feelings, or bad behaviors. So for somebody like Badeline, I feel that maybe journaling and some workbooks and things like that might be really helpful to her. And the outcome, hopeful outcome here, would be to increase Badeline's confidence and overall well-being and decrease her negative self-criticisms. Because I think that we learned through the game that Badeline is very brilliant and very capable, and it's only her negative self-thoughts that are holding her back. And when she embraces Badeline in the end, and they're able to climb the mountain together, I mean, she climbed the top of Celeste Mountain. I don't think very many people could say that. I certainly can't. Now, let's talk about representation in this game. So I have on screen a picture of Badeline and Theo in the lift while she's having a panic attack, with Theo literally saying, "You're having a panic attack." And you can see the clouds are dark. And you can see she's crunched up in a little ball, and Theo's comforting her. So something I really like about this game is that depression and anxiety is spoken about openly. You know, there's Theo at one point asks her, "What's it like?" And Badeline honestly answers. And I think that a lot of games are, oh, we're implying depression, we're implying anxiety, we're implying all of these things. And it's really refreshing to have a game say, yep, I have depression, and this is what it's like for me. Again, what it's like for a single person. These things can present differently among different people. However, some people might play this game and really connect. So I think that speaking about it so plainly, openly, and honestly has been just chef's kiss. Anxiety attack and mindfulness are discussed in plain terms. So when we're in the lift with Theo, his advice is to do a mindfulness exercise that his grandfather taught him, which is really cool. It's the feather. So you're supposed to think of your breath, breathe evenly in and out. You're gonna use your breath to keep a feather up in the air, and you don't want it to go too high to fly away, and you don't want it to go too low to touch the ground. And I think that a lot of people, not just people with depression and anxiety, can benefit from mindfulness exercises. It really reminds us to slow down, come back to center, and just remind us that we are here in the present moment. We cannot change the past. We can hope the best for the future. We can only act now. And I think that mindfulness is a really helpful tool for a lot of people. And another really good part of representation of mental illness in this game is that Badeline's mental disorders are a big part of the game, yes. But the focus of the game is not that these disorders are debilitating, that they stop her, that she can't overcome them. In fact, it's quite the opposite. This game is literally about someone coping and overcoming some of the, issues that they have with their own mental disorder. And I think that's beautiful and great. Far too many games like to use mental disorder, mental illness as a wrench in the game of, well, you can't actually do that now, haha, depression, and I think that this game's saying, yes, I have depression, yes, I have anxiety, yes, they're gonna slow me down temporarily, as they do, but I'm still gonna climb the mountain, is just a wonderful message and a wonderful representation. I would say that Badeline is, how we say, a high-functioning person, meaning she has these problems, but she is still very much able to go about her daily routine, go about her every day. But I think the fact that she climbs this mountain really, it just really tells me nothing can stop you but you, you know? And especially when we are so absorbed in this negative self-thought that depression puts on us. And it just is a really great story of somebody overcoming their battles, even though these battles aren't physical ones, these are internal ones. And yeah. Overall, I think Celeste is a great game. It's really fun to play, although very hard. I had to play it on assist mode because my hand doesn't exactly work the way it used to. I think that it does a great job explaining ego psychology and representing it in a game. And I think it also does great representation for depression and anxiety, as well as showing us some really cool mindfulness techniques in a game. Who'd have thought a video game could do all of this stuff? Well, Celeste does it. And if you haven't played it, which I really hope you have if you're watching this, at least to this point as well, do go back and play it or watch somebody play it if you're not physically able to play it. It is a wonderful game with great messages. And thank you all so much for watching. And I hope to catch you in the next episode of Playing with Psychology. Bye.